Hi, everybody. Welcome to the second annual International E-Conference on Atheism. My name is Dr. Darren Slade, and I'm the president of the Global Center for Religious Research, which is hosting this year's academic conference. Now, something to keep in mind is that GCRR is not interested in converting or deconverting anybody from any particular belief system. We are strictly an academic institution, and we seek to approach the discussion of God and suffering purely from a scholastic standpoint. And that's one of the great things about GCRR is that you're being joined by students, scholars, and specialists from all over the world, right from the comfort and safety of your own home. And because each of these presentations are video recorded, the information presented here will be available to anybody who had purchased a ticket to the two-day event as a way of saying thank you. Also, as a special gift to everyone, I will put a link in the chat box over Zoom. And for those who are not on Zoom, you can go to the GCRR website and look up our newest publication called God and Horrendous Suffering. And if you scroll all the way down to the bottom of the page, you'll be able to download a special sneak peek preview of the book by clicking the preview button. And if you decide you'd like to get the book, we recommend going directly through GCRR because our prices are lower. And we'll also offer you 15% off the retail price. All you have to do is enter the promo code SUFFERING, that's all in lowercase, SUFFERING at checkout. And I'll also place information about that in the chat box. Now, for those attending live, feel free to use the chat box to discuss with other attendees or to ask questions as they come up, and our speaker will do their best to answer your questions at the end of the presentation. You'll also be able to unmute yourself at the end so you can directly ask the presenter questions of your own. Now, one last thing I think you might want to know about. The Global Center for Religious Research has established the most comprehensive international research group to study the causes, manifestations, and treatment options for those suffering from religious trauma. But we have a bit of a problem here. In order for victims of religious trauma to receive help, we need to arrive at a place in our culture where religious trauma is recognized as a real mental health condition. And unfortunately, the academic study of religious trauma is still in its infancy. That means there is no exhaustive empirical study to support what we've all seen and experienced, that religious trauma exists and is a chronic problem. As it stands, really only anecdotal case studies have been published, but nothing substantially empirical. Well, GCRR intends to correct this gap of knowledge, and we'd like to get your help with this work. We've set up a GoFundMe page in order to crowdsource the world's very first comprehensive sociological study on the existence, causes, and manifestations of religious trauma. Now, why did we have to go and set up a GoFundMe? Because the federal government actually halted all federal funding for mental health research, which means the grant we were going to receive got taken away. So now we're turning to the public for help, just to ensure that this very important study actually gets going. All you have to do is go to GoFundMe.com and search for the phrase religious trauma sociological study, and you'll find us. You can read all about who's involved, what we're doing, the objectives, and everything. I'll also put a link in the chat box. And at the very least, we'd love it if you would share the GoFundMe page across all of your social media platforms, just to get the word out about this very important research topic. And with that said, I'd like to introduce you to my very good friend and our next presenter, Tori Cotton. And allow me to share my screen in order to give a proper introduction. So Tori's presentation today is called In Defense of the Hypothesis of Indifference. Now, Ms. Cotton is a graduate student in philosophy at the University of Arkansas. She currently holds a BFA from the University of Texas at Austin and pursued graduate continuing education in applied ethics at Texas State University. Her current research interests include analytic approaches to philosophy of death and dying, free will, luck, and good and evil. So it's perfect for this conference. With that, Tori, thank you so much for doing this. I'm so excited to hear your presentation. You have the floor.
Thank you, Darren, for your wonderful introduction. As you've heard, my name is Tori Cotton, and I'm here today to present over the hypothesis of indifference. So I thought I would start with just overviewing the problem of evil in general. So the problem of evil raises a number of big questions for theodicists, or those who attempt to rationalize the existence of God. For instance, is there an all-knowing and all-powerful and all-benevolent God, just as described in the Judeo-Christian tradition? Can we argue for that God's existence in spite of needless experiential suffering in the world? And can we reconcile that suffering with the existence of an omnibenevolent God without revising our definition of God itself? I'm not here to answer any of those questions today. Those are far too big. My proposal instead is a rather small one. I'm not seeking to supplant the prevailing position on evil or suffering, but merely defend one particularly strong argument for why God cannot exist from a few potential criticisms that have been raised against it. So the hypothesis of indifference is the philosopher Paul Draper's proposal in light of the problem of evil. His claim is that pain and pleasure that we experience in our lifetimes have absolutely nothing to do with God or some other supernatural force acting as an agent of good nor evil. I'm going to argue here that Draper's hypothesis of indifference is a better explanation for why we experience pain and pleasure than theism is, in that it survives those criticisms that have been raised against it. Namely, critics of his theory have been Peter von Igwagen and William Alston, who are other philosophers who are contemporaries publishing in this field. So you have an idea of where I'm going with this. I'm going to present a summary of Van Inwagen and Alston's criticisms. I'm going to present an argument in support of Draper's hypothesis and say that it provides a better explanation for the roles of pain and pleasure as biological functions of humans than theism does. I will then address a potential counter-argument made by Van Inwagen that if the hypothesis were a better explanation than theism, we would be able to expect different patterns of pain and suffering than we experience in the actual world. I'll then address Van Inwagen's criticism with a reply from Draper and synthesize those. I'm also going to present a second argument for Draper's position and cite the idea that it'd be reasonable to expect we wouldn't experience pain without some morally sufficient reason caused by our bad actions. I'm also going to go into Alston's criticisms after that, namely that if we are not in a position to make judgments on the likelihood of God's reasons for suffering, then the atheistic claim that God has no morally sufficient reason for suffering must be implausible, and I am again going to argue against that claim. So let's get into it. Paul Draper's text, Pain and Pleasure, an Evidential Problem for Theists, is extremely influential because it extends the scope of the traditional evidential approach to evil. Earlier evidential arguments from evil focused on instances of evil things as proof that God is unlikely to exist, and responses to those arguments from the theistic stance focused on analyzing what sort of epistemic, that means knowledge, access that humans can have for the reasons for suffering and evil to begin with. This has led philosophers to debating on the sort of epistemic access humans may have to know God's moral positions. Draper put forth a different view. As stated earlier, Draper's text has had two major contemporary critics, Van Inwagen and Alston. Van Inwagen's argument is essentially that if Draper's hypothesis is successful, then the hypothesis of indifference would in fact be a better explanation for why we experience pain and pleasure than theism. However, if that state of affairs were the case, then we could know whether to expect patterns of pain and suffering similar to the ones in our actual world, or in another world created by a God which is omnibenevolent, omniscient, and omnipotent. But we cannot actually know whether to expect these patterns of pain and suffering. So Draper's argument supposedly fails. Alston's argument takes a different approach. He argues that all epistemic arguments from evil fail because humans are not in the epistemic position to judge if an omnipotent and omniscient being would be unlikely or likely to have sufficient moral reasons to allow suffering in the world at all. Draper asserts that his hypothesis provides a better explanation for the roles of pain and pleasure as biological functions of humans than theism does, and that some facts about how we experience pain and pleasure give us good reason to reject theism. Essentially, there are biological reasons pain and pleasure serve for humans. Notably, pleasure serves as a means towards encouraging human reproduction, while pain serves as a means of keeping us from damaging our bodies in some way which would inhibit us from fulfilling our biological imperative and continuing to propagate. Humans experience pathological pain or pleasure when the biological system fails to function properly in some way. Similarly, biologically appropriate pain and pleasure responses occur when they serve some sort of biological function. If pain and pleasure either serve some biological imperative or are the direct result of some dysfunction in pain or pleasure response, then the real world experience aligns with the hypothesis of indifference, but would not align with a viewpoint under which pain and pleasure serves some moral goal. This implies that the probability of the hypothesis of indifference is more likely to be true than the probability of theism. Van Intwagen, however, provides an argument against Draper's claim. If the hypothesis were a better explanation than theism for the roles of pleasure and suffering, then we would be able to know whether to expect different patterns of pain and suffering than we experience in the actual world in an adjacent possible world, which was created by that same omniscient, omnibenevolent, and omnipotent God. But Intwagen points out that we cannot really know this. For all we know, we humans come up with the stories that we do have to explain reality, which for all we know entail both theism and observations and testimony made by living creatures that go through pain and pleasure. Van Intwagen then provides an example of such a story. Every possible world that consists of creatures capable of thought must either have observable patterns of suffering consistent and morally equivocable with the observations made by those sentient creatures themselves. Otherwise, those patterns are at best one where the laws of nature appear to fail in a massive way. Some of the good in the world must be dependent on thinking moral beings, according to Van Intwagen. The existent good in the world is enough total good that it outweighs the patterns of evil and suffering which humans observe in their experiences and report through testimony. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this theistic stance, but he furthers by saying the unreliability of the world in this way would be a flaw of the world as we know it, one which is at least as grievous as the flaw of containing patterns of pain and suffering as those contained in our world. Van Intwagen further explains that according to him, two patterns of suffering are morally equivalent as long as there are no clear moral reasons to prefer one or the other. In light of this story, we have a reason to doubt Draper's hypothesis. However, Van Intwagen posits that if all of these sorts of stories, as the previous one, were really false, or only reasonable conclusion within our epistemic access must be to suspend our judgments on the hypothesis of indifference, on the existence of God, and our observations on it entirely. So he would say that we can't endorse an atheistic stance, we have to endorse a suspension of belief. If the only rational response is to suspend judgment, though, then there's no way for us to have any epistemic access to knowledge of patterns in pain and suffering like those contained in our world or in some adjacent God-created world. But for all we know, there could be a true story which entails both God's existence and our observations of suffering in the world. And conversely, for all we know, that story might be false. Thus, we cannot know for certain to expect patterns of pain and suffering like those contained in a theistic or an atheistic world. However, if some theistic story shows that humans cannot have epistemic access to knowledge regarding if they should accept one claim, the observations of patterns of pain and pleasure on theism over the other observations of pain and pleasure on Draper's hypothesis. Draper then employs Bayesian reasoning to refute Van Inwagen. He claims that theistic stories do not significantly raise the probability of the theistic account. And without taking out observations of evil into account, our observations about the hypothesis of indifference's likelihood are more probable than the likelihood of reconciling our observations with theodicy. In order for a theistic position to support the thesis that humans are not in the position to compare these antecedent probabilities, then theistic stories would be unable to judge the range or the value to the story given that theism were indeed true. Therefore, it's aprobable, ultimately good and undefeated. Since there are no actual existent theistic stories which accomplish all these things, there's no theistic account that this is true, good, and undefeated. The skeptical account about probability of Draper's hypothesis does not follow, and Van Inwagen's criticisms fail to undermine Draper's overall argument. As a second point in support of Draper's argument overall, if we apply the theistic view of good and evil, we're left with a view of pain and pleasure, which does not reflect the state of affairs in the world as we know it. Assuming that pain is in fact bad and pleasure is in fact good, we would be reasonable to expect that we wouldn't experience pain without some morally sufficient reason, at least in cases were there a God. So when we make bad actions, we would be punished by God with suffering. And when we make good actions, we would be directly rewarded by God with lots of pleasure. This is simply not the case. And there are two major reasons not to believe that this is the case. Bad things happen to good people all the time, and evil people go unpunished. As an extension of that, non-moral agents such as infants or animals suffer needlessly in the world. And beyond that still, even though pain teaches us lessons such as don't touch the hot kettle on the stove, there's no reason that that would extend to pain teaches us some moral lesson, or we need pain in order to be motivated towards moral action. In fact, some ethicists might argue that if you're only motivated towards good action in order to avoid pain or punishment, then you're not really making good actions at all based on your intentions. This points back to Draper's first assertion that pain and pleasure serve biological functions rather than God-given moral functions. Another potential counterclaim comes from Alston. He begins his reply by citing the fact that typical evidential arguments from evil, Draper's included, proceed in the following manner. If the assertion that the traditional understanding of God would have morally sufficient reasons for allowing suffering is unlikely, then God's existence would be similarly improbable. Alston attempts to refute this reasoning by stating that if we are not in a position to make judgments on the likelihood of God's reasons for suffering, then the atheistic claim that God has no morally sufficient reason for suffering must be implausible. If that claim is in fact unfounded, then the atheistic claim that God's existence itself is improbable must also be unfounded. It then follows that if the atheistic claim regarding God's existence being unlikely is unfounded, then all evidential arguments from evil would have to fail. Alston's main argument is that humans cannot directly pass judgments on the likelihood of an omnipotent and omniscient God's morally sufficient reasons for suffering. He believes that if humans really are not in the position to judge in this way, that every evidential argument from evil is defeated on the basis that all evidential arguments from evil proceed in that vein. But Draper again points to a evidential argument inspired by Hume. He says that some evidential arguments do not argue for the improbability of God's existence on the basis of it being improbable for God having morally sufficient reasons for allowing suffering. Alston's claim does not apply to Hume-inspired evidential arguments. It is merely an assumption that all probabilistic arguments from evil must reject the claim that humans cannot judge the likelihood of God's morally sufficient reasons. Alston gives no reason for assuming the truth of his claim. So even if we really could not make judgments on God having morally sufficient reasons for suffering, some evidential arguments which do not argue for this could theoretically be successful. Thus, Alston's interpretation of Draper's hypothesis mischaracterizes Draper's claim and fails to undermine the possibility of the hypothesis of indifference being more likely than theism. So, because I've wanted to keep the scope of this presentation fairly narrow, I've attempted to focus on just Draper's main argument and the direct responses. But there's one consideration that, while I've not substantively included, seems prudent to mention as further support for Draper's argument. And that consideration is the possibility that an all-powerful and all-good God could design our biology in such a way that we don't actually need pain or pleasure to orient our goals in the first place. So to counter this, the theist would have to claim that suffering is an inherent part of the process of making the soul or character building. But it appears to me that even if we were to suspend our disbelief and claim that God could design our biology in such a way, it serves some divine purpose. We lack epistemic access to understanding of good and evil. And that would really need to serve a moral purpose designed by God to lead us to some higher path, which undermines both the scale of suffering in the world and as well as the scale of suffering in our everyday lives, which would directly lead us to the idea that death just happens with no possibility for further spiritual growth in life, as in examples of things like mass genocide. The prevalence of people who go through terrible experiences and either are spiritually unchanged or even convert to atheism as a result of that terrible experience is high. If it is the case that atrocity and suffering seem to leave people unchanged or directly bring about their death, having no time for spiritual growth or change in the first place, there's only one potential response to Draper, and it still seems to fall short by way of overcomplication of the purpose of suffering and in willful inattention to realities of it. So again, even if you say that suffering, makes the soul or suffering serves some divine purpose in shaping us as humans, you undermine the fact that there are people who are born to die. And there are people who live their lives in immense suffering without ever a reprieve. They don't have time to grow substantively in any spiritual means. So by this reason, it seems that Draper's argument seems modest by comparison to the theodicy of saying that suffering plays some role. It's more likely to say that there is no God in the first place than to claim that God has put suffering here and he's indifferent to it. By this comparison, Draper's argument satisfies more or less Occam's razor. The hypothesis of indifference provides a simpler explanation for why we have pain and pleasure than any theodicy which opposes it seems to do. And with this further consideration in mind, combined with the successful defense of Draper's position from his critics, it seems clear to me that Draper's case for the superiority of the hypothesis succeeds. So In conclusion, the prevalence of such distinct and long abiding suffering in the world poses a very strong problem for theists who attempt to explain suffering by way of God put suffering on here for a reason, or theists who claim that suffering is here because God is indifferent to it or we're meant to go through it. I would like very much to thank you all for coming.
Wonderful.
And I hope you enjoyed.
Ms. Cotton, thank you so much for bringing this topic up. I think Draper's hypothesis of indifference is sorely neglected in the literature. I don't think it's taken as seriously as it should be. But I kind of wonder if Draper's formulation of it, it's actually very elementary. It sounds very much like the no duh argument, as in, we know pain and suffering exists, and the Christian God, the Jewish God, the Muslim God wouldn't exist if these pain and suffering exists at the same time. It's kind of this very elementary, non-nuanced thing that he then flowers up with a lot of technical language. And I suspect that's one reason why he's not get appreciated as much. Would you agree with that at all?
I strongly agree with that. I think that Draper's position, the approach that he takes, is almost like the Morean argument for epistemology, where More holds up his hand and says, here is one hand, here's another, therefore I exist. It's a very similar approach.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to ask you if you thought that Draper succeeded in his, for lack of a better word, his polemic. It sounds like you do think so. But there's one objection I'm not sure I actually heard, so forgive me if I'm repeating or forcing you to repeat. In my estimation, Draper's foundational claim is not so much the biology of good and pleasure, but his propositional statement, which is, we know that pain and suffering, or pardon me, pain and pleasure exist in the world. He often has that statement, statement, reporting what we know about the pain and suffering in the world. I think that this is foundational because one objection that gets leveled against him is that what the theist knows about pain and pleasure in the world is not the same thing as what a non-theist knows about pain and pleasure. Have you come across this objection, and do you have a response for it?
I have not come across this objection, and I think that in attempt to answer it, the only thing you might be able to do is create some standardization for the way we experience the world, and maybe appeal to the fact that sensory experience might be standardized. Otherwise, you'd have to argue for an entire immaterial system by which you conceive of the world. And that seems more difficult, again, to argue for than saying we're all physical bodies that experience the same general senses.
Yeah, your hunch is right. Absolutely. And also impossible because us coming to an agreement on what criteria we're going to use to be able to say what we do know, as you already know, is just futile. I think one reason that a theist might bring up this objection is because for them, Draper is giving propositional knowledge about pain and pleasure in the world, whereas the theist claims a non-propositional knowledge related to pain and suffering plus deity, if that makes sense. So they're kind of claiming that both sides have no objectivity in this. When Draper says, hey, we know that pain, these are the statements that we know about pain and pleasure in the world, the theist says, well, you don't know the whole story. You don't know all of it. We actually have some esoteric knowledge, some mystical knowledge, spiritual knowledge, biblical knowledge, whatever, that you're not counting in. So it seems like both sides are wanting to say, well, we actually don't know what we think we know, or you don't actually know all the stuff. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think that in arguing with theists, I think this often comes up. And you have this proposal of, well, my God exists because you cannot prove that he doesn't exist. And that's a real problem for addressing the theistic stance. And the only thing I have to say in defense of this is that, well, I'm not necessarily attempting to prove that God doesn't exist. I'm saying that the biological imperative of pain and pleasure seems to satisfy a very real function that is easily explained. We have it like a rational explanation for why we have pain and pleasure in a way that we don't need to add theodicy to that explanation. So the existence of pain and pleasure itself doesn't verify that there is a God.
Yeah, and to incorporate more beings, a supernatural dimension, things like that is just ad hoc. You're adding and adding and adding elements that don't necessarily need to. The biological function of organisms is a reasonable and simple explanation, and you don't need a devil, and you don't need a God, or whatever else. One objection that I would present to the theist is that they claim to know something more about pain and pleasure that the non-theist doesn't. And I think the term know, K-N-O-W, knowledge here is being equivocated. What they really mean is I have faith. I have a belief that of more details to reality, but it doesn't count as knowledge.
I would entirely agree. And I think in response to that as well, you could raise that why does the theist, if God were to exist, if you grant them that, why does the theist have some raised epistemic access to the knowledge that God would have for the reasons that pain and suffering exist? And I think that poses an additional problem, because if you just say, well, I believe in God, therefore I know what God thinks, you're almost putting yourself on the level of God himself, which is almost you're like weighing your experience of the world at a higher stance than the atheist. And that seems to go against a lot of what the Christian doctrine stands for. So
and there's a lot of arrogance to it as well. I know something that you don't know. And how is that? Because I'm special. I have a special relationship, communion with the divine. One other objection, or one other, I don't think it's an objection to Draper, but one other interesting polemic assertion against it might be that Draper is assuming some level of rationality and objectivity when he's approaching this. So what a theist might argue is the problem of evil and suffering is not what causes unbelief. The unbelief is chosen first. And the problem of suffering is actually a consequence of presuming non-belief. That nobody gets to the problem of suffering because they're objectively looking at things, and that this argument leads them to a non-belief. Rather, they had non-belief, and then they use the problem of suffering to back up that belief. So how do you feel about that?
I think the strongest response in those cases is to appeal to advents of children who experience undue suffering. Because if you look towards theology, a lot of theologies will assert that children have this child of God access. And so if you appeal to the case of, a 5-year-old, God forbid, gets murdered or goes through a terrible instance of torture, they don't have enough time in the world to even form a belief about God's existence or non-existence. All they know is suffering. And so that I think that's the biggest case that poses a problem.
When examining that, would that necessarily lead, I don't want to say necessarily, would that lead somebody, a rational mind, let's say, to non-belief? Or does it really only hold water if you're already a non-believer? And let me know if I need to clarify what I'm asking.
To reiterate or to rephrase your position, are you asking that are those instances of suffering to me evidence towards the non-existence of God, or could you rephrase?
Yeah, absolutely. No, this is a more general question. Are non-theists engaging in a confirmation bias because they're already non-believers? For whatever reason, they have either never been a believer or they deconvert. And in their deconversion or in their non-belief state, they go looking for evidence to support non-belief. And the problem of suffering is just one of those evidences that they go looking for to validate, to confirm their non-belief. But it's only after the fact. It's not that they went to the problem of suffering and said, oh my gosh, look at all this data I have about suffering, therefore there must not be a God. Are we engaging in a confirmation bias?
I don't think it's necessarily a confirmation bias, because even if you are a theist, if you believe in God and you say God must be all good and all knowing, you still get hung up on the fact that if there's suffering in the world, then God has to know about all those things. And if God knows about all of the suffering in the world, how do you reconcile like an all good being that has the power to change it, to change all the existent suffering instances, without God himself becoming an author of sin, becoming the person who sets us on a path to do evil? And so that would undermine the entire idea of an all good God. And I think that poses a genuine problem.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I don't want to monopolize time. So if anybody in our audience has any questions or comments, feel free to unmute yourself or start your video or raise your hand. Otherwise, I'm going to keep on talking. Yeah, I think you're onto something. We do know of a lot of cases where people just could not reconcile the suffering, maybe in their own lives, with the God that they continue to worship. And it leads to non-belief. And as even apologists themselves admit that the problem of evil, the so-called problem of evil, is easily one of the most difficult, if not most impossible, rebuttals to refute for their position. Go ahead.
I think it's certainly difficult to approach the problem of evil, because from the theodicist standpoint, it's a continuum. You get these early approaches which attempt to say, well, the problem of evil isn't just the problem of things that are evil in the world. That can be explained by some evil demon in the Descartesian, sense. And then you hone it in from, okay, evil is caused by the devil. You say, well, then if God created everything, then God must have created the devil. So again, that creates another problem. You say, well, God created the devil in order to enact his own will, and what the devil chose to do with his free will is fine, and we all have free will to enact suffering. And you say, well, that poses a problem for the all-powerful nature of God, because again, you could intervene in specific instances. So then you hone down again and you say, well, then you're not just talking about suffering, you're talking about needless suffering. And I think that's really what we mean to get at the heart of here, is that it's not suffering in itself that causes a problem for theism. It's needless suffering. We can go through a bad day and people can have miserable lives, but needless and truly pointless suffering poses a genuine problem, because if God were truly good and put us on here to become like children of God, or to enact some like religious doctrine of worship, then why would we be put here in cases where we never come to know God at all?
Yeah, this is what John Loftus has labeled horrendous, the problem of horrendous suffering. It's that gratuitous, meaningless type of torture that doesn't help people grow, doesn't help them attain some spiritual higher level. of significance or communion with the deity. Why Draper though? What drew you to this part, and why not? So he's not taken that seriously with this particular issue, and there's so many other, I think, maybe better counter apologetics. So why Draper for you?
Why Draper for me? I think that the raised objection to adjacent worlds where God is a creator while saying that our world may not be created by God, I think that's an interesting counterclaim against Draper, and one that you don't get to see posed against some of the earlier atheistic writers. So I think that eliminating the possibility that even if God didn't create our world, he also didn't create the universe is a very important point.
Interesting. And you think Draper still holds, especially with his emphasis on just the biological functions of organisms, do you think that that is still valid, or would you say that it's not as helpful as he thinks it is?
I think it could be improved upon. I think it's a good working theory, if I can put it that way. It poses a genuine problem, but it doesn't pose a sufficient explanation for why we have suffering. It creates a problem for the theodicist as a whole, but I still don't feel like it's a fully serviceable account of why, I suffer or feel pleasure.
Well, that's the interesting thing. When we appeal to evolution or biology, there's almost always an out for the theist, which is to say, yeah, God designed it that way. So when Draper says, well, I have a simple explanation. We're just biologically programmed to experience pain and pleasure, and that they serve a function for our survival and whatever else. And the theist says, yeah, I agree, but God did it. Of course, we might come back and say that's ad hoc. You're adding more to an already simple explanation, but I'm not so sure it does as much damage as he thinks it would have.
I think you're correct there. There's definitely that out where you just say, well, then we're all created by intelligent design, and the fact that we feel pleasure and pain is part of that. And Draper doesn't address that. No, it could certainly be addressed.
Well, Ms. Cotton, thank you so much for this. I really, I love that you picked up on a very niche topic within counter apologetics and apologetics, because almost nobody addresses him and this his very unique approach. Does anybody else any other comments or questions before we wrap this session up? Okay. Well, I will say once again to everybody who attended, thank you so much for your support and for being with us. We have another presentation coming up at the top of, actually, I guess it'd be in 1 hour and 10 minutes from now. So I hope I see you for the rest of the conference. Ms. Cotton, thanks again for doing this. I will let you have the last word.
I just want to say thank you so much for having me. It's been a genuine pleasure, I guess in Draper's terms, to be here, and very much appreciate the ability to present my work.